What's happening, Boot Junkies? Mike Delgadio here, back with another video on home studio setup for VoiceOver. The other day, it occurred to me that I have a number of different microphones that all have the same pattern. I've got shotgun microphones, large diaphragm condenser microphones, handheld microphones, short condenser, pencil condenser microphones, other pencil condenser microphones, and they all have the same pattern. They're all supercardioid microphones. So with all these different microphones that all have the same pattern, how do you know when's the right one to use in the right situation? And I'll be honest, I don't know every situation when every mic would be appropriate, but I know someone who does. And that's my friend Alan Williams, who you may know from the SoundSpeeds channel. So I took a chance and asked him if he'd come and talk with us on the channel, and he graciously agreed to it. So I'd like to share with you the conversation that Alan and I had about all of these microphones. Okay, so Alan, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So why don't we start with who are you and what do you do?
Okay. Well, my name is Alan Williams. I'm a boom operator that works in the film industry. I also have been doing sound since the mid-90s in some sort of a way or another. Started doing movies, mixed some smaller things, boom operator on big things. And then about 5 years ago almost, I started doing SoundSpeeds here on YouTube.
And if you're new to my channel and you've never been to Alan's channel, I strongly encourage you to go visit his channel. He's got some really, really incredible content, and he's become quite an educator to me over the past few years as I've been a subscriber and a viewer of his channel. That's why I thought you would be an excellent person to come talk to us about.
I was so excited about this topic when you reached out and said that you wanted to talk about it. I'm like, yes, let's talk about this because some of the questions that you asked, that you said, these are the kind of questions I'll be looking. Some of those people don't talk about. And I love diving in deep.
Yeah,
so
well,
I get excited for this kind of stuff. Yeah,
let's do it. When we talk about different microphones, we see a lot of commonality between the different form factors. For example, what I thought we'd talk about today is I've got in front of me 5 supercardioid microphones.
Yeah.
But they're all in a different form factor. I'd love to talk about what goes into when would we choose these microphones?
Okay.
And what are some of the considerations that we would put into it for situations, maybe using film sets as an example, since you're in a real wide variety of sets, some treated studios, some very practical studios where if you're booming in a real house that isn't really acoustically treated.
Right. Totally. It all changes. Let's start off real quick and easy by defining the difference in your world versus my world.
Yeah.
Your world is in a very controlled space. You have acoustic foam all around you. And what does a shotgun microphone do with that interference tube? It focuses the sound. You will technically reject out the outside world with a shotgun microphone. But you don't need to do that with a shotgun microphone in your booth. You don't have to worry about rejecting out the outside world as much because all you care about, the only noise source you really care about is coming from your mouth, and you don't need to worry about the outside world. But in my world, in the world of film, we don't have acoustic foam all around us. So we have to rely on the engineering of a shotgun microphone to reject out the outside world. But there's also those little vents on the side of them, vent slit slots, whatever you want to call them. Those on the side of a microphone actually change the way that the sound comes into the microphone. And so what those do, depending on the engineering, depending on how thick the casing is of the microphone, depending on how wide the vents are, depending on the pattern, are they all just on one side, just on the top, or on the top, on the bottom, or like on that CMIT 5U, hold that up for a second. Tell me about the vents you see on that.
I was actually going to ask you about that because as I compare it, they're all the way around as opposed to some of the other shotguns.
But they're also wider. It's actually wider and it's deeper. So what it's doing is it's allowing more of that sound to get in on those, but it's also, because it's not just this thickness, it's actually maybe a little bit thicker. Then what it's still doing is it's still rejecting out, but it's channeling that sound in a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Because it allows vents to pull in sound from all around it. The vertical and horizontal axis is sound that comes in bouncing off, because it's not just about the sound that comes straight in the front. There's also acoustic in the way it bounces around the environment, because the sound will travel up and it also will travel back in from different sources. So if you have a shotgun microphone pointed straight at you and those vents are just on the top and the bottom, like on your 416 there, then it's only allowing those sounds in. If I put a microphone up that only has vents on one side, just on the top, for example, I have to know which side of that microphone they're in. Because if I like to play it on the top or the bottom of that microphone, I have to be consciously aware that that area of the microphone is going to pull in sound differently than it will on the opposite side.
I think this may be where you're going. I read in the Shep's owner's manual that it says it's rotationally symmetrical.
That's
so
exactly what I was talking about with
if
the top and the bottom
rotate.
axis. Yeah,
Right.
That's exactly it. A lot of boom operators don't think about that kind of stuff acoustically, and we don't have time to. But with something like a Shep's, you don't have to worry about it because it's very even all the way around. It still does a great job of rejecting out the background noises, but it's very even. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff in a booth as much because your sound is only coming from one source. But we have to worry about footsteps. We have to worry about cars in the background, noises, air conditioners. We have the real world, even acoustics in a kitchen environment with hard surfaces. We'll have play coming off of, if someone leans over a table, I have to know to take that boom microphone horizontally to get off that table. Because if I don't, and I go like this, the sound is going to acoustically bounce off of that. It's going to be reinforcing their chest cavity base. It's going to be basically making it then kind of echoey because it's going to be bouncing from here to the ceiling. There's a lot of stuff that has to go into it. You have to, that's why I always say, listen, because it comes into play.
If I understand correctly, then you should actually be thinking about if you have a 416 or an S Mic 2 that's got just vents, say, on the sides, that when you're mounting it in your pole or when you're positioning this microphone, you should think about how that's being rotated. And maybe there's a slight difference in sound. So if you're rotating it, that's something to think about.
It is, but boom operators don't normally have time to.
Have time.
Most of the time, though, if you're doing a sit-down interview and there's a really offensive air conditioner, then one of the things you could say is, well, the vent's over there. And if I have the microphone straight over top of them, I'll angle away from that a little bit, and I might angle it so that way the vents are working more to my advantage. It might cut half of a dB or something off of it. But still, it's one of those things that if you have a microphone, you can dial it in acoustically if you want to, even with the rotation of the microphone. But like I said, most people don't think about that. They just throw the thing up there.
Okay, so that's actually super helpful from a shotgun perspective. Now, what you see a lot in people mentioning is if you're indoors, that maybe a shotgun is not the right choice, and maybe you should be thinking more about the pencil condenser because the way they handle the reflective noise, they handle it differently. What are the considerations? And would you put a pencil condenser like this on a pole, or are these more like planted in certain?
No, you'd still boom with it. Absolutely.
Still booming? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind the interference tube on the front of it. That is very small on the MKO-12, the Octava you just held up, versus a shotgun microphone. You got to keep in mind that all the sound from any direction based on that pattern is going to be coming into the capsule, and it doesn't matter the direction. It's going to be summed into one line out. A shotgun microphone, the understanding and the idea behind it is that it's supposed to be picking up sound at a greater distance. However, the MKO-12, it's very small. The capsule is very close to the end of the microphone. That's going to be hearing more of the outside world. It's not going to be dialing more in. So in exchange for you not having as narrow of a pattern, in exchange of that, you're going to be hearing a little bit more of it. But that also means, just like on a cardioid versus a shotgun microphone, like what you're used to, just like if you use a cardioid, you have to get closer on it, but it sounds much more full, doesn't it? Than it does if you're on your shotgun microphone farther away. Right. That's because they're two different designs. If you get closer, or you have a super cardioid pattern microphone, that Octava, for example, and you're inside of a room like a kitchen with everything as a hard surface, it's not going to be reaching as much because that shotgun microphone doesn't just hear your mouth right here. It's going to hear beyond you as well. So one of the things that you in a booth are going to be having that microphone mainly pointed right at your mouth. Your voice comes out here and your face stops it. It doesn't hear past you. If it does, it's going to be picking up your acoustic foam. However, in the film world, if I did that exact thing, you're going to hear not just the mouth right here. It's going to not necessarily stop at the face. It's going to pick up what's behind me as well. So if it's coming overhead and I'm over a table, you're going to hear all that reflection and bounce coming straight off of that table, straight off of the roof and back into the microphone. I have to think about the timing of a voice right here. And if I have the microphone here and it's picking up off of the table and back in, you're going to hear that as echo or reverb. So I have to keep in mind all that kind of stuff acoustically, and I'll have to change it up based on the waves. There's 3 different types of waves that you normally run into. There's the waves between 2 surfaces, between 4 surfaces bouncing around in 4 axes, and then there's the waves that go everywhere. And I have to keep in mind and juggle those waves on the fly acoustically based on the way they sound in my ear.
I also imagine in your situation that you have to really get to know your microphones, because it's my impression that supercardioid, any of the cardioids, they're really ranges. So that the width of a supercardioid on mic A and mic B,
yes,
they're just narrower than cardioid, but it's not like specifically sensitive and 10 degrees on either side of the center point or something like that. It's
you definitely do need to know your microphones, because all the microphones are different. You got to keep in mind also that even with a supercardioid pattern microphone and not necessarily a shotgun, it's still picking up the area in front of it, but there's also the off-axis sounds you have to worry about as well, because those are going to be coming in as well. Something on some microphones, for example, they're basically focused mainly on the front, and then if it's off-axis, it drops off real quick. Others will blend it, and it will start to slowly fall off in volume more gradually. Others will start to actually color the off-axis sound. It'll start to sound really weird. You'll hear more of the lower frequencies and not the highers, or vice versa. Normally, you'll lose the highs if you start to go off-axis.
That's certainly what I've noticed. Is most microphones they are much more directional in the highs. And I think that's just sort of universally true with sound, right? More directional as you get higher in frequency.
That's it. I mean, that's exactly the way it is. The lower the frequency is, anything below about 50 hertz is omnidirectional. And it takes more power for you to shove lower frequencies out of your voice, and they go in all directions. So if you were to turn completely around the other direction, the lows in your voice are going to be pretty much the same coming in your microphone. The mids and highs are more directional. So the mids are going to be maybe like this, and the highs are going to be farther away. But the directionality of the frequencies of a human voice, the highers are going to cut through over a distance directionally, and the lows are going to go in all directions. And it's not linear. So if you raise your voice and elevate it, even if you do it evenly in the lows, mids, and highs, the bass frequencies are going to spread out and use that power more. It's not going to spread the same way as the mids are going to, go out farther and farther and farther, and the highs are going to go really far, like a narrow bullet.
That's helpful in thinking about, like, even just as a voice actor, when we stand in front of the microphone, a lot of times, very, very animated actors, I think that's why a lot of people like the cardioid pattern, is because you do have a greater degree of freedom in front of it to move around, to gesticulate. Whereas the narrower patterns, I often say they can be more forgiving of a less than ideal treated room, because they don't hear that, but you really do have to lock in a lot more closely in front of it, because your voice can change, sometimes significantly, as you go 10 or 15 degrees off that center point, especially from the highs. You can lose a lot of detail. Can sometimes help to be a few degrees off if you've got, like a super bright, a sibilant voice. Sometimes you just got to rotate that mic just a little tiny bit, and you can darken it up, I guess, for lack of a better word.
But it's the same kind of thing if you look at the pattern. That's the reason why the microphone pattern says, oh, well, this is 250 hertz, this is 500 hertz, 1000 hertz, and it starts working its way up. The higher the frequencies are, the more that pattern starts to come in, until the very, very highest frequencies, it'll almost look like fingers coming out on a shotgun microphone on the side. And that's because, if you remember those vents, the ones that are closest to it, it's going to be hearing out of those the most.
Some of the mics that I have literally never been in front of in person are the really long shotgun microphones. When we think about, like, what is it, the 816 is the one I'm thinking of from Sennheiser.
Yes.
That's probably like
the
twice
816
as
and
long.
the 416 are the same. Yeah, the interference tube is longer. Yeah.
Is that for greater directionality? Is it like more focus? Is that really what it does? It become like an ultra cardioid or something, for lack of a better description?
Kind of. It's like, if the longer the interference tube is, the more focus it's going to be. Actually, it's really funny. In the beginning of my Rode NTG8 video, I do a pretty good job of setting up and explaining the difference between a short shotgun and a long shotgun microphone. I can't just do a straight up review. I have to educate and teach all these things in it. So, and because you mentioned short versus long shotgun microphones, hold up your 416 for a second.
So this is S-Mic2S, but dimensionally, I think
S-Mic2S. So that's a short shotgun microphone.
Right.
Tell me, do you see a difference?
Other than length?
Yes, that's the big one.
That
Right
I mean,
there.
length is the big one, but that one, I mean, clearly way more. The capsule, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the capsule is at the end of the at the end of this the little slots that are cut into. That's really where the diaphragm is. Is that right?
It depends. It depends.
Ah,
Like, for
okay.
example, if you were to look here, I don't know if you can actually see it, but actually you can. Look right here. You see where it's kind of goes discoloration right here?
Okay.
You can barely see that right
Yeah.
there. That's
Yeah.
where the capsule is right here.
Is that right?
And notice over here, there's a little bit of an area behind the capsule. That's the rear lobe of that short shotgun microphone.
I see.
It's still
Okay.
not short, but it's a shotgun microphone.
Mhm.
And so it's going to be picking up, if it put this capsule right back here, it's going to be picking up nothing really behind. And in order for it to acoustically, the engineers, acoustically make it so that way it's going to pick up a little bit of the rear sound too, so it still sounds even. But
Mhm.
right here is where that capsule is inside of this little area. And you still have the interference tube out the front here, which is going off the screen. It's like way over there.
Yeah.
So it's basically a very directional microphone, but that capsule is actually located right here. And if you look at many of your microphones, your short shotgun microphones, you can actually look inside of it. Sometimes they'll actually have a break in the interference tube, and it will actually look, you won't see vents right there. That's probably where the capsule is.
Are there ever times on sets where you would use the more large diaphragm, or are these really just for studio? Do you ever? I remember we had a conversation a long time ago, and you were talking about like sound design gathering, recording gunshots and things
stuff,
like that. Is that when these kind of, maybe not this mic in particular, but is
Not
that
that
when
one.
your condensers come into play? The large diaphragm condensers, or would you ever use them to gather dialogue on set?
You don't normally now.
Mhm.
Because you got to keep in mind, there's been a lot of very good technological innovations with regards to smaller condensers. But there's so many different things that you can use now, so many different options. You don't need to resort to large diaphragms on set anymore.
Right.
Usually
right.
you're going to have a lot more low end, because of the larger diaphragm, it's going to pick up more handling noise if you put it in the hands of a boom operator. So you don't
Sure.
want to have to mess with that.
I certainly can imagine that if you're not in like a soundstage set, that if you're in a practical place, you're not going to put it on a big shock mountain. Like you just floor noise, people
Right.
walking around because there's so much stuff happening.
But you see, one of the things I did on Walking Dead is for the big all-out war with Negan versus the Rick Grimes and his group on season 8, for example, that we did like so many gunshots, and for a while, one of the things I was doing, but then after that it got too crazy, and I was like, I'm not going to do this anymore because it was nuts. But I went out there with an Akg C4000b, which has a high SPL. If you enable the 10 dB pad on it, it can take like an SPL level of like 155 dB. I went out with 2 of those, and we put those on different areas. And I put that out there because if you shoot a gun, you'll hear it echo off of everything. But then I realized that what they're doing is they're going to replace all that in post anyway, because
I was just going to ask.
we shot a lot of blanks on that.
I have no experience. Do blanks even sound remotely like actual ammunition? Like when they're fired, is it similar?
Yeah, because the difference is you take the bullet part off the end, you crimp
Right.
it, and it's still the gunpowder.
Right.
So that's the
I just
difference.
didn't
It
know if
doesn't
it
have a
sounded-
projectile. Yeah.
I've never actually
you
been
see-
in the presence of a blank being fired. I have no idea if it's the same.
And there's also a dummy load. A dummy load has the bullet on the end, but on the inside there's no gunpowder. But the main thing I also want to point out that you would use large diaphragms for is like I did a Netflix movie called Devil All the Time in 2019. I think it was released in 2020. But one of the things that when we were shooting out in the woods, I used an AKG C4000b, for example, in one of those. And I use them every now and then because a cardioid versus a dynamic doesn't pick up all those trailing off higher pitched sounds that echo. And so you use a high SPL large diaphragm, and you put a pad on that with the dynamic range we have on a lot of these microphones now. They can set the level. The mixer can set the level. No, not 32-bit floating point. We're using 24-bit like pros do, and then they record it, and it goes smack and hits that diaphragm really hard. Makes a really nice, loud sound. But then you hear it go,
Right.
and it trails off.
Wow.
It sounds really good at a distance. On American Soul, for example, there was a sequence that we did at the very beginning of season 1 that took place in, I believe it was Vietnam. And in those sequences, we used a couple of those large diaphragms. We used them as like an A-B space pair. So we used them in omnidirectional mode. We put them together and we panned one hard left, one hard right. We recorded that sound. When you listen to it for this gunfight sequence where you had two guys fighting and then there was a explosion in the background, oh, it sounded good on set. We're like, oh, they better use this because it sounded so good. And that's where you get is a lot of those trail offs and the big concussions and the smacks and the impact. Right. It sounds really good on a large diaphragm.
We haven't talked about like the handheld microphones. Like this is a super cardioid microphone that I don't know it has any probably actual use on set, but I do know that you often see mics used as props.
Yes.
And I don't know if they actually, do you know if they're actually gathering the sound? So if somebody's standing in front of a mic to address a crowd or they're filming somebody doing a podcast, you'll grab that sound, won't you?
Absolutely, we will.
Yeah.
We'll plug up to that. As a matter of fact, if you look at a lot of movies and stuff, if they have multiple microphones on there, it's pretty easy if you look at them to figure out which one's ours. Because ours is going to be the one that looks like it's properly placed in the right angle. It's going to be the one that usually has the most premium looking XLR cable coming out of the back of it. It will also be the one that will most likely be centered more in their voice, unless they're directionally, only talking to one direction. It's also the one that's probably in the best condition because a lot of times props will have the same ones. So that microphone, for example, the Beta 87A. If you look at a lot of those microphones, those can usually handle, if it's a condenser like the 87A, for example, then it's going to be made for you. It's going to have a lower sensitivity and in a dynamic that's going to be fine. But on that one, I think that the sensitivity is like -48, -50. It's like really low. It's very low. And the reason why is because it's going to be used on a stage and people scream into it. It's designed for people to scream into. So it has a high SPL also.
You're supposed to be right here to it. You're supposed to be just an inch off it as opposed to some of these other ones where you should be a foot or more off it. Do you ever stray away from cardioid and narrower? Do you have uses for omnidirectional or figure of eight microphones when you're on set?
I've never used a figure of eight. But I have used the omnidirectionals usually if it's special effects, if it's gunshots, if it's explosions, that kind of thing. Aside from that, I will go to my normal go-to is going to be some sort of a super cardioid pattern microphone, unless there's multiple people sitting at a table. And in that kind of circumstance, I don't need to have the reach as much. I need to have more width. And so at that point, I don't need to have as much play off the table. So if I have a super cardioid pattern microphone pointed, square on top of them, I'm going to be picking up a lot of that bass off the table. A cardioid is going to pick up less because it doesn't reach as deep, but it's going to also sound fatter on the voice. So there's a little bit more forgiving. So I don't need to do as hard of a cue of the microphone from two people. I can go from here more, and as opposed to cueing like hard off the table this way, I can go more without breaking the plane, is what we say, without changing the axis of the microphone.
So let's close it with this question. Imagine that you're setting up your live streaming home studio and you don't want the mic in frame. You want to be like I'm talking to you right now. I have a microphone that's just out of frame. So acoustic treatment is at best the egg crate foam that they got from Amazon. What is your thought process for selecting a microphone? Because you hear people saying you got to have a 416, you got to have a pencil condenser, you really should have whatever it is. Like what you're thinking about this, you want to gather the best sound for the camera. What should people be thinking about?
It depends.
It does,
okay,
doesn't it?
For example, the room that you're in right now, how quiet is it? Are you in an environment that is right next to a bus stop? Is your house four corners brick with, sound dampening windows? Or are you in the middle of an apartment complex and the walls are paper thin and you hear the baby crying next door? I mean, it depends because there's a lot of factors to keep in mind there. If you get a shotgun microphone, it's not a magical device. It's not going to be able to suddenly reject out every single thing out there, even if you put it barely out of frame. If you're a gamer, if you're doing a gaming stream, you're going to be click, 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 knocking on a keyboard or whatever else. You have to also cue that off. You have to get that microphone off the table, get that off of it and cue it more horizontally. Even though it may seem ridiculous, you might want to even aim the microphone straight over the top of your head. because it's this way, and the pattern is still going to pick up your mouth just fine, but it's going to reject out more of that kind of stuff. There's times that someone has a very deep voice on set and they're sitting at a table, and I won't just take the microphone horizontal to them. There's been some people I have to angle it slightly upwards on and get off of that table so much because there's so much bass in their voice. It really depends on the person, and it really depends on the environment, and depends on also what the person's doing. If they're just recording a podcast, but they're doing it on camera, there's a lot of factors you have to take into consideration there too, because you may say you want it out of frame, but there's a difference between if it's out of frame like right here and if it's out of frame farther away. If I were to use a dynamic, it's not going to pick up nearly as well. You want to use a condenser, but then you might want to use a pencil condenser because it's not going to be able to pick up this as well as a shotgun. But then will a pencil condenser then, in that case, pick up too much of the room? And if the room is going to be in a very noisy environment, then you might not want to use that. You might want to use a shotgun so that way it rejects out more of the room in order to try to dial in on your mouth, and you're going to have the clicks and keyboard and stuff noise in there. So there's a lot of factors. That's why it's not as easy as when someone says, "Oh, Mike, you do voiceover. What's the best voiceover microphone?"
Sure. It depends. I mean, the answer is
you want me to just say U87 because that's the one everyone uses? You want me to just say, well, that's it? I mean,
right.
But it's not though. And so it also depends on the microphone, the pattern. It depends on the sensitivity. It depends on there's so many factors that go into it. That's why there is no one right microphone for every circumstance. That's why in a voiceover booth, when you don't have to worry about things like rejection on a shotgun microphone, then you have to worry about the tonal quality that it comes down the barrel. But in the real world, like when I do stuff out there with a shotgun microphone, all those factors come into play. So it really is one of those things you kind of have to know your microphones. You have to know what they're good at. You have to know where they're going to be most beneficial to you and what's going to sound best in those environments.
Well, this has been so incredibly educational. I learned so much. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful for your time.
Glad to, Mike.
Great. Well, we'll talk to you next time.
Absolutely.